arch-shaped lamina of gray substance extending over the corpus callosum and above the hippocampal gyrus from the anterior perforated substance to the uncus. A. The subcallosal gyrus, gyrus subcallosus, pedicome of the corpus callosum, is a narrow lamina on the medial surface of the hemisphere in front of the lamina terminalis, behind the paraolfactory area, and below the rostrum of the corpus callosum. It is continuous around the genu of the corpus callosum with the supracallosal gyrus. B. The supracallosal gyrus, indusium griseum, gyrus epicallosus, consists of a thin layer of gray substance in contact with the upper surface of the corpus callosum and continuously laterally with the gray substance of the cingulate gyrus. It contains two longitudinally directed strands of fibers termed respectively the medial and lateral longitudinal striae. The supracallosal gyrus is prolonged around the splenium of the corpus callosum as a delicate lamina, the fasciola cinerea, which is continuous below with the fascia dentata hippocampi. C. The fascia dentata hippocampi, gyrus dentatus, is a narrow band extending downward and forward above the hippocampal gyrus, but separated from it by the hippocampal fissure. Its free margin is notched and overlapped by the fimbria, the fimbrio-dentate fissure, intervening. Anteriorly, it is continued into the notch of the uncus, where it forms a sharp bend and is then prolonged as a delicate band, the band of Giacomini, over the uncus on the lateral surface of which it is lost. The remaining parts of the rhinencephalon, that is the septum pellucidum, fornix, and hippocampus, will be described in connection with the lateral ventricle. Interior of the cerebral hemispheres. If the upper part of either hemisphere be removed at a level about 1.25 centimeters above the corpus callosum, the central white substance will be exposed as an oval-shaped area, the centrum ovale minus, surrounded by a narrow convoluted margin of gray substance and studded with numerous minute red dots, puncta vasculosa, produced by the escape of blood from divided blood vessels. If the remaining portion of the hemisphere will be slightly drawn apart, a broad band of white substance, the corpus callosum will be observed connecting them at the bottom of the longitudinal fissure. The margins of the hemispheres which overlap the corpus callosum are called the labia cerebri. Each labrium is part of the cingulate gyrus already described, and the slit-like interval between it and the upper surface of the corpus callosum is termed the callosal fissure. If the hemispheres be sliced off to a level with the upper surface of the corpus callosum, the white substance of that structure will be seen connecting the two hemispheres. The large expanse of medullary matter now exposed, surrounded by a convoluted margin of gray substance, is called the centrum ovale majus. The corpus callosum is the great transverse commissure which unites the cerebral hemispheres and roofs the lateral ventricles. A good conception of its position and size is obtained by examining a medial sagittal section of the brain. When it is seen to form an arch-straight structure about 10 centimeters long, its anterior end is about 4 centimeters from the frontal pole, and its posterior end about 6 centimeters from the occipital pole of the hemisphere. The anterior end is named a genu, and is bent downward and backward in front of the septum pellucidum. Diminishing rapidly in thickness, it is prolonged backwards under the name of the rostrum, which is connected below with the lamina terminalis. The anterior cerebral arteries are in contact with the undersurface of the rostrum. They then arch over the front of the genu and are carried backwards above the body of the corpus callosum. The posterior end is termed the splenium and constitutes the thickest part of the corpus callosum. It overlays the telochoroidea of the third ventricle and the midbrain and ends in a thick convex free border. A sagittal section of the splenium shows that the posterior end of the corpus callosum is actually bent forward, the upper and lower parts being applied to each other. The superior surface is convex from before backward and is about 2.5 centimeters wide. Its medial part forms the bottom of the longitudinal fissure and is in contact posteriorly with the lower border of the falx cerebri. Laterally, it is overlapped by the cingulate gyrus, but is separated from it by the slit-like callosal fissure. It is traversed by numerous transverse ridges and furrows and is covered by a thin layer of gray matter, the supracallosal gyrus, which exhibits on either side of the middle line the medial and lateral longitudinal striae already described. The inferior surface is concave and forms on either side of the middle line of the roof of the lateral ventricle. Medially, this surface is attached in front to the septum pellucidum. Behind this, it is fused with the upper surface of the body of the fornix, while the splenium is in contact with the telochoroidea. On either side, the fibers of the corpus callosum radiate in the white substance and pass to the various parts of the cerebral cortex. Those curving forward from the genu to the frontal lobe constitute the forceps anterior, and those curving backward into the occipital lobe the forceps posterior. Between these two parts is the main body of the fibers which constitute the tapetum and extends laterally on either side into the temporal lobe and cover in the central part of the lateral ventricle. The lateral ventricles. Ventriculus lateralis. The two lateral ventricles are irregular cavities situated in the lower medial parts of the cerebral hemisphere, one on either side of the middle line. They are separated from each other by a median vertical partition, the septum pellucidum, but communicate with the third ventricle and indirectly with each other through the interventricular foramen. They are lined by a thin diaphanous membrane, the ependyma, covered by ciliated epithelium, and contain cerebrospinal fluid, which, even in health, may be secreted in considerable amount. Each lateral ventricle consists of a central part or body and three prolongations from it termed cornua. The central part, pars centralis ventricula lateralis, cella, of the lateral ventricle extends from the interventricular foramen to the splenium of the corpus callosum. It is an irregularly curved cavity, triangular on transverse section, with a roof, a floor, and a medial wall. The roof is formed by the undersurface of the corpus callosum, the floor by the following parts enumerated in order of their position from before backward: the caudate nucleus of the corpus striatum, the stria terminalis and the terminal vein, the lateral portion of the upper surface of the thalamus, the choroid plexus, and the lateral part of the fornix. The medial wall is the posterior part of the septum pellucidum, which separates it from the opposite ventricle. The anterior cornu, cornu anterius, anterior horn, precornu, passes forward and lateralward with a slight inclination downward from the interventricular foramen into the frontal lobe, curving around the anterior end of the caudate nucleus. Its floor is formed by the upper surface of the reflected portion of the corpus callosum, the rostrum. It is bounded medially by the anterior portion of the septum pellucidum and laterally by the head of the caudate nucleus. Its apex reaches the posterior surface of the genu of the corpus callosum. The posterior cornu, cornu posterius post cornu, passes into the occipital lobe, its direction being backward and lateralward and then medialward. Its roof is formed by the fibers of the corpus callosum passing to the temporal and occipital lobes. On its medial wall is a longitudinal eminence, the calcar avus, hippocampus minor, which is an involution of the ventricular wall produced by the calcarine fissure. Above this, the forceps posterior of the corpus callosum sweeping around to enter the occipital lobe causes another projection, termed the bulb of the posterior cornu. The calcar avus and bulb of the posterior cornu are extremely variable in their degree of development. In some cases they are ill-defined, in others prominent. The inferior cornu, cornu inferior, descending horn, middle horn, medial cornu, is the largest of the three, transverses the temporal lobe of the brain, forming in its course a curve around and posterior end of the thalamus. It passes at first backward, laterward, and downward, and then curves forward to within 2.5 centimeters of the apex of the temporal lobe, its direction being fairly well indicated on the surface of the brain by that of the superior temporal sulcus. Its roof is formed chiefly by the inferior surface of the tapetum of the corpus callosum, but the tail of the caudate nucleus and the stria terminalis also extend forward in the roof of the inferior cornu to its extremity, where they end in a massive gray substance, the nucleus amygdalae. Its floor presents the following parts: the hippocampus, the fimbria hippocampi, the collateral eminence, and the choroid plexus. When the choroid plexus is removed, a cleft-like opening is left along the medial wall of the inferior cornu. This cleft constitutes the lower part of the choroidal fissure. End of section 15.